The next item of business is a statement by Richard Lockhead on supporting students through the global pandemic. The Minister will take questions at the end of his statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Richard Lockhead for up to 10 minutes, please, Minister.
Thank you. Going to university or college is an exciting time for our young people, with many leaving home for the very first time to make lifelong friends, join new clubs and learning new things as well. But this year is different and challenging because we are in the midst of a global pandemic. And I'd like to say directly to students and all staff in our colleges and universities and student accommodation, thank you. Thank you for the sacrifices that you have made since the start of the pandemic. Thank you for what you are doing to support each other and to help keep everyone else safe. I know it's really hard right now. Indeed, it's heartbreaking, especially for first years who may have already missed out on once-in-a-lifetime experiences such as final school exams and proms and traditional freshers' weeks. And I know I speak for no doubt the whole of Parliament, indeed the country, when I say to students I'm truly sorry that due to the pandemic, your introduction to college and university life is not what you or your families or indeed I would have wanted it to be. It's important students have the opportunity to continue with their learning. Limiting access to education has a negative impact on their personal development, their well-being and life chances. And our country also needs a stream of talented and trained individuals, and we need our world-leading colleges and universities that employ many, many people and underpin the Scottish economy. That's why we have consistently planned for some face-to-face teaching in colleges and universities as part of a blended return to campus during Phase 3 of the Government's route map. This approach is supported by recent SAGE advice, which highlights that some sectors, such as research and healthcare, require face-to-face teaching. It also highlights the impact of remote learning on wider health and well-being. The SAGE report states, changes to the structure of higher education may exacerbate these effects by decreasing the ability of people to make friends, engage in social activities together, gossip and chat, and interact with tutors or mentors, as well as by increasing the difficulty of work and studying. And that, I'm sure you all agree, is particularly important for vulnerable students and social inclusion, and for first years who have already missed out on so much because of COVID. Against the backdrop of a global pandemic, there were no easy, risk-free options. A record number of young people have worked hard for their entry qualifications and have been stuck at home for months, and then they geared up for going off to university or college and the next stage of their lives. Along with stakeholders, we decided that asking them to all stay at home and begin their courses online would have inflicted significant harm on them and the wider further and higher education sectors in Scotland. The advice also pointed out the risks and likelihood of COVID outbreaks when the new academic year got underway. We were never advised to keep students at home, but we were advised that mitigation factors were vital. And we have worked together with colleges, universities, accommodation providers, unions and other key stakeholders throughout this crisis on the safe return of further education and higher education. And we issued sectorial guidance which clearly states the rules we expect to be followed. We've worked extensively to support the sectors in implementation. And throughout, we have used the best scientific advice available, including from SAGE, in helping us make decisions on balancing the risks. That's why our guidance emphasises that colleges and universities should use risk and equality assessments to decide what a blended learning approach and model looks like within their own institutions. And institutions should be working with their staff and students to discuss any concerns they have about the use of face-to-face teaching and enabling more online where that can be done. Our guidance also sets out the infection prevention and control measures we expect institutions and accommodation providers to have in place. Importantly, in the context of the current situation, we expect institutions to help students comply with the rules and to support them in doing so. There's a clear duty of care to their staff and students. And it's important to emphasise that any new restrictions we put in place are for the protection of the whole of society. All of us, students included, are being asked to follow the same rules on socialising and self-isolation. We published additional guidance last week to inform students wishing to return home of their options and how the new national restrictions apply to student households. It contains advice on returning home for a short visit, returning home while self-isolating, and returning home on a more permanent basis. But our key message is that students should remain living in their current student households and on campus if they are able to do so. That will also ensure students can maintain social connections, access student services and face-to-face teaching where appropriate where it's taking place. And crucially, it will reduce the risk of large-scale virus transmission and help keep us all safe. While we have no evidence to date of transmission within an FE or HE teaching setting, we do have outbreaks amongst our student population, with significant clusters in university student accommodation. From the approximately 250,000 students who attend our universities every year, around 45,000, give or take, of them usually stay in student halls, with around 43% being first-year undergraduate students. From data received from Public Health as of today, we are in the unfortunate position that 759 of these students have tested positive for COVID, and as we know, many more are self-isolating. We are using testing in line with our published testing strategy to ensure it will have the greatest impact in reducing the risk of disease transmission by testing those with symptoms so that those with COVID-19 can be identified, be asked to self-isolate and their close contacts traced. Test and Protect was ready for the new academic year and is working. But of course, we're always working to improve access for testing for students and the wider communities. Kits have been provided and mobile test units dispatched in Glasgow and Dundee, and there are now walk-in through test centres in St Andrews, Glasgow, Aberdeen and Edinburgh, with further centres in Stirling and Glasgow opening in the next week or so, and more sites under development as well. We remain mindful of clinical advice about the limitations of asymptomatic testing and the need to prioritise our testing capacity in line with the testing strategy. However, we are exploring the merits of some targeted surveillance testing focused on individual institutions to understand the level of asymptomatic cases. And to be clear, due to the incubation period of this virus and the testing that is taking place, we do expect to see more positive cases in the coming days. That's why everyone with symptoms should self-isolate along with their household. Now, I've heard some really good examples of how institutions are supporting isolating students, such as providing food and cleaning materials and protecting welfare and delivering mental health support as well. But, like others, I've also been disappointed to hear from some who have been struggling to access that support or information. Whether you're a student from Scotland or elsewhere in the UK, away from home for the first time perhaps, or one of the tens of thousands of international students that have chosen to study here and are thousands of miles away from home, each and every student deserves the utmost support, and anything less is wholly unacceptable. So I want to be clear, universities and student accommodation providers have a duty of care to their students, and right now this must be their #1 priority. Universities should be providing a gold standard state campus support package for all students self-isolating. And I note that this afternoon the 19 higher education institutions have published a joint pledge of what they want to deliver for students in Scotland, and I welcome that. That support should also include signposting for already available mental health counselling services. Much of that's been funded by the Scottish Government, and we're actively considering what further support we can give in that area as well. Universities should also look sympathetically at students who have left or want to serve notice on their tenancy and reapply at some future point. These are extraordinary times, and we are asking every institution to be extraordinarily supportive and understanding. We will also provide resources to student associations and NUS Scotland to help them engage directly with students, to hear what they have to say, to make sure they have the latest public health advice and they also know their rights as well. I've also asked the National Incident Management Team, who are overseeing the outbreaks on campuses, to reflect on the experience of recent days, to specifically consider what can be done to minimise repeated periods of self-isolation and the general issues around isolation for students, many of whom we all know, perhaps from our own history of being students, live in small rooms in the halls. We are 6 months into this pandemic and it's far from over. In light of the outbreaks and cases among students, we must now redouble our efforts to control COVID-19. Importantly, we want students to have the option to return home safely at Christmas. We are working with the sector on the best approach. That includes looking at the public health measures, staggering term end dates and transport considerations. We will work with the UK Government and other administrations to bring as much consistency across these islands as possible. So in closing, I want to emphasise that students are in no way to blame for the circumstances they and we find ourselves in. The reports I am hearing is that the vast majority of students have coped well in the very difficult circumstances they find themselves and are complying with the guidance. It's often said that until we have a vaccine, we have to learn to live with COVID. It's also the case that whilst we have COVID, we must also allow our citizens to learn and to teach and educate and get on with their lives. And we must not allow the virus to steal one of the most important years in the lives of our young people. We can't underestimate how tough that is. But to staff and students, I say again, thank you for all you are doing to keep yourselves and others safe. And my message to all our students is that you are Scotland's future, but we do need your help right now. We're all in this together. So let's keep working to get through this. Thank you.
The Minister will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement, and I'll allow around 20 minutes for that. Would those members who wish to ask a question please press the request to speak buttons. And I call first of all Jamie Green.
Can I thank the Minister for his statement, and I thank students and our university staff for their efforts. I agree on the importance of face-to-face teaching, but the current situation for many is quite bleak. The handling of recent events left thousands of students confused over guidance, which was hastily written, then rewritten, as the Scottish Government struggled to respond to circumstances that were entirely predictable. Students were told last Friday they were banned from going to the pub or going out. They were banned from returning that weekend to their family homes. They were ordered to stay in their halls of residence en masse, despite not testing COVID positive or being tested at all, with many given no physical or mental support. And the Minister is keen in his statement to stress that students are being treated equally to the rest of us in society. But I simply say to him, speak to them. Many feel like they are not. So let me ask for some clarity on the following, Minister. Given the virus prevalence on campuses, why is frequent widespread community testing among students still not been introduced, with the obvious benefits that that will bring? Is it testing capacity or some other reason which prohibits it? Why is the government asking universities simply to be sympathetic to students who have to leave their accommodation, but provides no comfort or indeed certainty that they will receive refunds for accommodation if they do leave, and guarantees that they can return? And finally, Presiding Officer, and it's an important point of process, can I request of the Minister that future major and important changes like this to guidance or regulations are made to this Parliament in the first instance, and not announced in the hours after we leave this building and then changed again before we return to it? It's not good enough for us, Presiding Officer, and it's certainly not good enough for students.
Richard Lockhead.
There was a number of points there from Jamie Green, and I thank him for his questions. Some were, of course, which were widely inaccurate, and I'll try and address them briefly. But in terms of testing, clearly we are following the test and protect regime in Scotland, which the advice we've had in terms of student populations and the rest of the population is the focus has to be on delivering testing capacity for students with symptoms. And also in terms of international students arriving from certain countries, they undertake their 2 weeks quarantining. I have said, and we know that in England, for instance, there's a couple of universities involved in a research pilot for random testing and perhaps the mass testing that Jamie Green is referring to, and we're paying close attention to that research pilot. And I've said in Scotland we will explore, and we've asked public health officials to explore if there's a role for asymptomatic testing in Scottish campuses as well. So, you know, we're following a similar testing regime as elsewhere in the UK, and I'm not sure why he thinks that's the wrong thing to do, is following the advice of the public health officials. In terms of the guidance, I mean, we published our guidance the 1st of September for the safe opening of our campuses for colleges and universities. We worked with stakeholders on that, and it was published in time for the campuses opening. In terms of the guidance last weekend, we issued guidance for students so they could understand the new restrictions that had only been in place in Scotland for a few days. I was attacked by the leader of the Tory party in Scotland for not publishing that guidance several months ago, but the guidance it was putting into the context for student households had only been published in the previous few days. And it was important that students on our campuses understood how the restrictions just that came into force a few days ago apply to their circumstances where they want to go home. And as I said yesterday to the member, that's been warmly welcomed by students and student representatives in terms of giving them the clarity they needed about what these restrictions mean if they want to go home. In terms of the advice that was issued by University of Scotland, which the Scottish Government endorsed, that was following a successful policy at St Andrews University, where to help curb the spread of the virus, the student population at St Andrews were asked not to socialise one particular weekend, and as a whole the sector said the same message to the rest of the population. It wasn't a ban, it was an ask of the student population, and thankfully, and I thank them for this, many of Scotland's students abided by that request and played their role in helping us keep us all safe.
Ian Gray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The truth is that the government failed to prepare a plan properly for students' return, and then, panicking, rewrote and contradicted their own advice every few hours over the weekend, communicating randomly by press release and tweet. Universities were left to police the guidance, ever-changing, to provide food and to refund rents. Now, universities are ordered to provide gold standard support. Well, this is a gold standard government fiasco, just like the SQA results shambles to which many of these young people were also subjected. Today's frankly insipid statement will provide little consolation or hope. At least ministers admitted that they got the SQA results wrong. So will the Minister admit that he got this wrong and apologise properly to Scotland's students for that? Will he publish all the advice he says he followed and the stakeholder discussions he says he had? And will he promise universities actual financial support now to allow them to support students and to refund rents?
Richard Lockhead.
I'll start at Ian Gray's last point in terms of financial support for the sector. This is a huge challenge for Scotland's students. It's also a huge challenge for Scotland's universities and indeed to an extent for our colleges as well. And of course, we're having regular conversations with them and we'll continue to discuss the financial consequences of coping with the outbreaks and indeed the current situation across Scotland. So we're certainly keeping that under review. In terms of our overall approach, I explained that the guidance for the safe reopening of colleges and campuses, which has largely been adhered to, and we have no evidence it's not being adhered to, was published on the 1st of September prior to the opening of Scotland's universities, which opened earlier than the rest of the UK. A similar approach, of course, was taken by the Labour government in Wales, the Conservative government down south, and indeed the Northern Irish administration also. And as you know, I'm sure you've seen, there have unfortunately been outbreaks because we're in the middle of a global pandemic in all administrations. That is because we're dealing in a very difficult situation where there were no easy options. I'm not sure what different approach Ian Gray suggested we should have taken, but the approach we have taken was to let people go on to the next stage of their lives, and we're doing our best to keep them safe.
Both front bench questions went over time, so I don't think I'm going to get through all these, though I'll try if everyone else does. Rona Mackay, followed by Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We know that students in Scotland have access to the most generous level of financial support than anywhere else in the UK. So can I ask the Minister what discussions he's had with Students' Award Agency Scotland and the Student Loans Company to ensure that students who may need to submit a late application to gain access to financial support will be processed and awarded as quickly as possible?
Richard Lockhead.
We have had many conversations with the Student Loans Company and also the Student Awards Agency to make sure that we're taking into account the extra challenges that Scotland students face at the current time, and they have already introduced some flexibility. And in light of students who are self-isolating or caught up in the current situation in Scotland, we'd also expect that to be the same approach from both the Student Loans Company and the Student Awards Agency in Scotland as well. So that's a very important point in terms of making sure that we don't have extra anxieties being experienced by our students at this time.
Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you. The Minister's statement makes clear that he had advice highlighting, and I quote, the likelihood of COVID outbreaks when the new academic year got underway. And we know that at least one advisor to the Scottish Government had advocated routine testing of students on arrival and then again on a short interval. But it's only now that the Scottish Government is exploring the merits of some targeted surveillance testing. So can I ask the Minister, I raised with him on the 2nd of September my concerns that I didn't have confidence in the testing regime, so the regime that the Minister was relying then on. So 759 identified cases
Could
later,
you get to your question,
does the
please?
Minister now accept that his failure to introduce routine testing in halls of residence was a mistake?
Richard Lockhead.
We have a test and protest strategy in Scotland, which the Scottish Government, working with our public health advisors and the Chief Medical Officer, and indeed the advisory groups who give us the scientific advice, have agreed with us, and which we are implementing across all parts of Scottish society, including campuses. And that is that we should focus on testing students or any citizens in Scotland who have symptoms of COVID and ensuring that they get the results of their test and then their contacts are traced. And that is working well. That is why we have so many students, unfortunately, but that's why we have students self-isolating and have identified those so we can protect them and the rest of society. Now, of course, testing is always developing. How they're delivered, the results they can give you are always, is always being developed. And our scientists are taking close interest in where that's going. And of course, if it offers further opportunities for a testing regime in Scotland, I'm sure they'll be taken on board. But this testing regime in Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland, it's similar because it's the best one available, and that's why we're using it.
Stuart McMillan, followed by Joanne Lamont.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a former international student, I'd be grateful if the Minister could tell me what reassurances have been provided to international students who will be feeling extra pressure of being in a different country and under potentially different rules as compared to their home country.
Richard Lockhead.
I have discussed with our universities, as I know they are aware, the importance of supporting our international students at this time. And indeed, that work has been underway for many months, given that this global pandemic has been with us. And, for months and months, this is not something just in the last few weeks. So it's a very important point that he makes. I know some universities are offering additional support to international students at the current time, and I would urge them all to do that.
Joanne Lamont, followed by Ross Greer.
Thank you. I have to say that I feel this statement is a ministerial catch-up on the real world and not a terribly convincing one at that. But can I ask, he argues for the benefits of blended learning. Students were told coming back for blended learning, only to discover that their learning was entirely online. So did he have an agreed definition with universities and colleges on what blended learning actually meant, and when and how was that shared with students? Richard Lockhead.
I referred in my opening remarks to blended learning and how we approach that, and I've explained that to Parliament already. Clearly, we have said to universities and worked with them closely, working with stakeholders, the trade unions and the student organisations, as well as the universities and colleges themselves, that where we are with the pandemic means that there will be many cases where students can learn online, but there will always be a requirement to some degree for face-to-face teaching. We've also said, as I indicated in my opening remarks, that if any student at the current time is uncomfortable because of where we are with the virus, and the virus has been increasing in Scotland for some weeks now, then the universities, the lecturers should be very sympathetic if those students want to have more online teaching and less face-to-face. But there are some courses where face-to-face is absolutely essential. Practical courses, healthcare, veterinary courses, medicine, so on and so forth. They require practical face-to-face teaching and can't simply happen without that.
Ross Greer, followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you. I appreciate that some of the issues that I wrote to the Minister about have been answered here, but what I don't understand is the lack of detail and what seems like a lack of urgency around some of this. So can the Minister tell us what specifically the additional support the Government's considering for self-isolating students is, when a decision will be made on it and when that support will be delivered? Because they're isolating now. Richard
Lockhead.
It's the duty of the universities, first and foremost, who have a duty of care to their students and indeed their staff to deliver the supports required. That's why we have said to them it's absolutely essential that that is delivered as a matter of priority. And as I said in my opening remarks, they have published a statement this morning, collectively as 19 higher education institutions, giving a pledge that that is what they're going to do. We have also said to universities that we stand ready to help if that is required at the same time. And I want to thank Ross Greer for his letter. It was a very constructive letter he sent with some ideas, which I hope he feels have been reflected in today's statement, are being taken forward. This is a fast-moving, evolving situation. We have to make sure that no student in Scotland is left without what they require to get through this.
Willie Rennie, followed by Willie Coffey.
3 sets of guidance in 4 days is just not good enough. The Minister was warned about this for months and he ignored those warnings. He should just have the good grace to apologise to students right across the country. The asymptomatic testing reasons against it seem to be constantly changing. Today, it seems to be an issue of capacity. Can the Minister clear up exactly why we're not doing routine asymptomatic testing? Because principals and student leaders across the country are supporting this. I think he should support it as well.
Richard Lockhead.
Well, we take advice from our public health professionals. It's not my decision as Higher Education Minister on what the testing regime is in Scotland. But our advice at the moment and up to now has been the focus is on testing anyone in Scotland, including students who have symptoms. And other forms of testing have potentially a role to play, but clearly because in terms of asymptomatic testing, because the virus could be incubating, it's only as good as the test result on that day, so they may well actually have the virus and it's not picked up by the test, and therefore focusing on those who have symptoms and then tracing those that come into contact with and asking them to self-isolate is the advice we've had from the public health professionals in Scotland. But of course we are keeping that under review, and I, as Higher Education Minister, in the context of our campuses, etc., will continue to listen to the advice we receive. But Scotland as a whole is following the best test and protect and testing regime available to us at the moment.
Willie Coffey, followed by Liz Smith.
Thank you. Can I ask the Minister if he's able to provide an update on the uptake of the £5 million fund that was provided to universities to tackle digital exclusion and support students from the most disadvantaged backgrounds with their online studies, particularly during this time?
Richard Lockhead.
Thank you. That money is now available to our universities and further higher education to ensure that no one's left behind, because clearly there's a big emphasis on urging people to study online where that's appropriate, and it's ensure that no one is left without the equipment to do that. I understand the universities and colleges have already been using their own funds to make sure that happens, but the £5 million is also there as an insurance policy, and no doubt will be required in due course.
Liz Smith, followed by Shona Robson.
Thank you. Senior figures in the HE sector, Minister, are saying that last Wednesday, when the Scottish Government indicated that it would issue updated guidance to students, the 19 higher education students had precisely 4 hours to comply with Scottish Government instructions. Given the confusion that ensued in the following days, does he now regret that there wasn't fuller discussion of what the measures should be, and obviously all the U-turns that we've had since, which have led to so much in terms of mixed messages, anxiety and concern?
Richard Lockhead.
There's been no U-turns for the Scottish Government in this issue. I'm not absolutely sure what you're referring to. In terms of the guidance for the students who are being asked to not socialise last weekend, we endorsed the University of Scotland approach to make that ask. I do accept, though, that the communication was not perfect, and some of the newspaper headlines or other headlines I saw talking about bans. It was not helpful, and I'm not apportioning blame for that. I'm just explaining that there was a communication issue, clearly, in terms of that. But in terms of the other guidance, though, the guidance for universities and colleges was published on the 1st of September. And because we're dealing with a situation where there was national guidance brought in, also with short notice in terms of social gatherings and not visiting other households indoors, that we quickly adapted that for the context of student households, so that students, given there were outbreaks, particular on campuses, and many did perhaps want to go home if they were really struggling to cope with that, understood how the national restrictions apply to student households. And we got that out as quickly as we could. We're living in the middle of a global pandemic. We don't have as much time as we'd like. We don't have notice of the rate of the pandemic. We're doing our best to get through this, and it'd be really helpful if everyone could join together in doing that.
Shona Robson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I welcome the Minister's statement that a mobile testing unit has been dispatched to Dundee? Can he provide more information on when the unit will be in place and operational, and where it will be located? And in his statement, the Minister said that there will be further walk-through test centres under active development. Can the Minister say whether Dundee will be one of them?
Richard Lockhead.
Can I thank Shona Robertson for a question? I do understand, yes, and I'm told that Dundee is under consideration for a city centre testing location and walk-in centre, and there's conversations going on with the NHS Tayside, Abertay University and other stakeholders about that. So hopefully we'll be able to update the member in Parliament on that as soon as we can.
Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is one of the poorest set of decisions made in the crisis by ministers and universities who knew or ought to have known the risk to students in common halls to find themselves trapped and sick only to find that their teaching is online. Why, Cabinet Secretary? Did you not insist that students should have been tested on arrival? Was that not your duty as a Cabinet Secretary to insist that students arriving in communal conditions should be tested on arrival?
Richard Lockhead.
Paula McNeill raises the testing regime again, and as I've explained before, the advice we have is the best testing regime is to ensure that we are testing students with symptoms, because of the issues around asymptomatic testing. And that is the process, I understand, being followed in Wales, where her party is in government, and also south of the border, and Northern Ireland as well, because our scientific advice, I don't take these decisions, the advice we get from the public health professionals is that is the best testing regime. And we have evidence, of course, is working well on campuses.
Quick question and answer, please. Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I ask this question following a visit to Robert Gordon University in my constituency to see what measures they were taking. And can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what steps are being taken to ensure deliveries of foods and other essentials to those self-isolating, and whether the Scottish Government can facilitate a dialogue between universities and supermarkets to prioritise deliveries for those self-isolating, not only in halls but in smaller units of accommodation too.
Richard Lockhead.
Yeah, thank Maureen Watt for that question. And a few days ago, I met the COVID leads for each university in Scotland who are coordinating the strategies at local levels in each campus to make sure that self-isolating students get the supplies, medicines and foods they require. And clearly, in terms of also involving the supermarkets, I will ensure that they're taking that point forward as well.
That concludes questions on the Ministerial Statement on supporting students through the global pandemic. Apologies to Neil Finlay for not being able to take his question. And we'll now move on to the next item of business. Would members please take care in leaving the chamber to maintain social distancing?